rain hadn't stopped all day. It fell in sheets that turned the streets into glistening rivers, and every drop seemed to echo against the lonely walls of Marcus Brown's diner. The neon sign outside flickered and buzzed weakly, its letters half burned out, like it was struggling to breathe its last. Once that sign had been bright enough to light up the whole block, a beacon for families looking for warm plates of fried chicken, collard greens, and cornbread that tasted like home. Now it sputtered in the rain, a sad reminder of what used to be. Inside, the place was quieter than a church on a weekday. The booths with their cracked red vinyl seats sat empty, except for a couple of coffee mugs that hadn't been cleared away. The air was heavy with the lingering scent of fried onions and yesterday's grease clinging stubbornly to the walls. Somewhere in the back, the old refrigerator hummed, the sound uneven, like it was considering quitting on him, just like everyone else had. Behind the counter stood Marcus Brown, shoulders hunched, his broad hands wrapped around a dish towel he'd been using to wipe the same spot for the past 10 minutes. He was in his early 40s, though the gray creeping into his beard and the lines carved into his face made him look older. The world had weighed on him harder than most. His apron was frayed at the edges, a few grease stains set in so deep that no amount of scrubbing could make them disappear. But even with the exhaustion etched into him, there was something in his eyes that refused to dim completely. A stubborn flicker of kindness, of hope, though hope was the very thing everyone said would ruin him. The diner was nearly bankrupt. The numbers weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. His suppliers had stopped answering his calls demanding payment he didn't have before they'd even think about delivering more food. The regulars he once knew by name had drifted away, some moving out of the neighborhood, others simply deciding they couldn't afford to sit in a diner that felt more like a sinking ship than a place of comfort. And still, Marcus came every morning, turned on the lights, started the coffee, and waited. He didn't know what else to do. People said he was too soft to survive. The whispers floated in from the street whenever someone passed by and saw him slide a plate of food across the counter to someone who looked like they couldn't pay. He'd hear them outside, shaking their heads, their voices dripping with judgment. "He's feeding himself into an early grave," they muttered. "A man that soft won't last through the year." Marcus never argued. He never stormed outside to defend himself. What would be the point? Let them say what they wanted. He knew the truth. He couldn't turn away someone who was hungry. He just couldn't. He remembered his mother's words as clear as if she were standing in the diner with him. "Baby, you don't close your door on the hungry. God gave you two hands, one to feed yourself, the other to lift someone else." Those words had been stitched into the fabric of who he was. They echoed every time he looked into the eyes of a stranger who hadn't eaten in days. So even as his own world crumbled, Marcus kept serving whoever walked through his door. Sometimes it was kids with dirty shoes and hollow eyes. Sometimes an old woman who shuffled in with trembling hands. Sometimes men who carried the smell of the street on their clothes. He never asked questions, never demanded anything in return. He just cooked. Because if he could cook, then they could eat. It was that simple. On that rainy night, Marcus stood behind his counter, looking out at the empty diner, wondering how much longer it would last. The rain tapped harder against the fogged windows, and for a moment, he felt the weight of every unpaid bill in the office drawer pressing down on his chest. But then the bell above the door jingled, soft and unexpected. A figure stepped inside, dripping from the storm, and Marcus straightened, the towel still clutched in his hand. His heart beat a little faster, not because he saw a paying customer, but because he saw another hungry soul. And without hesitation, without even asking a single question, Marcus said softly, "Come on in, brother. You look like you could use a hot meal." He didn't know it yet, but that single act, that single plate of food, was about to start a chain of events that would change everything. The rain had eased into a mist by the time the door swung shut, but the man who stepped inside looked as though the storm had carved itself into his bones. His coat hung heavy and dark, dripping steadily onto the cracked tiles of the diner floor. His shoes squelched with every step, soles worn so thin they barely held together. His face was hidden behind a beard that had grown uneven and wild, and his eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had slept too many nights on unforgiving sidewalks. They were hollow, shadowed, yet sharp in a way that made Marcus pause. Marcus didn't ask for his name. He didn't ask what brought him in. He only lifted a hand and gestured toward the nearest booth. "Sit down, brother. You're freezing." His voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that left no room for refusal, only quiet acceptance. The man shuffled forward, each step slow, as though his body argued against moving. He lowered himself into the booth, shoulders hunched, hands trembling faintly on the edge of the table. The diner was nearly empty, save for two locals sitting in the corner, nursing their coffees like they'd been nursing their bitterness all night. They leaned closer, their whispers sharp enough to cut. "See that? He's at it again," one muttered, swirling the spoon in his cup. The other snorted, glancing at Marcus. "That's why he's broke, giving food away to every stray that wanders in." The words weren't quiet, and Marcus heard them as clear as the hum of the fridge behind him. His jaw tightened, but he didn't turn. He'd learned long ago that arguing with people who had already made up their minds was a waste of air. Instead, he poured a mug of steaming coffee and slid it across the counter, carrying it to the booth where the man sat like a shadow left behind by the storm. "Here," Marcus said, setting the mug gently in front of him. "This'll warm you up." The man's hands shook as he wrapped them around the cup, like even the heat was too much for his chilled fingers. Marcus didn't wait for thanks. He stepped back into the kitchen and returned moments later with a bowl of chicken soup, the last of the pot he'd simmered that afternoon, meant to stretch into tomorrow. He placed it in front of the man without ceremony, then added 2 slices of bread he'd saved from the back. The old man stared at the meal for a moment, almost disbelieving, before lifting the spoon with deliberate slowness. He took a sip. His eyes closed briefly and his shoulders eased, as though just that first taste had reminded him what it felt like to be human again. From the corner booth, the whispers grew louder. "Pathetic. He'll lose this place before winter. Kindness doesn't pay the bills." Marcus caught their reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine. His chest tightened, but he stayed silent, focusing instead on the man in front of him. There was something about the way the stranger ate, quietly, carefully, his eyes never leaving Marcus, that unsettled him. It wasn't suspicion, not exactly. It was something heavier, as though the man were studying him, memorizing the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he cared. And though Marcus didn't realize it, that gaze carried far more weight than the gossipers in the booth ever could. The stranger ate slowly, each bite deliberate, like he was tasting not just food, but the heart behind it. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the street in gray silence. Inside, the diner seemed to hold its breath. Marcus leaned against the counter, eyes heavy with fatigue, yet steady with resolve. He didn't know who this man was. He didn't know that this act of simple kindness would ripple far beyond the cracked walls of his diner. All he knew, in that moment, was that a stranger had walked in hungry, and he would not let him leave that way. The rain tapped harder against the glass, the neon sign sputtered once more, and the first thread of a story that would change Marcus's life began to weave itself quietly in the corner booth of his empty diner. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind streets slick with puddles and air heavy with dampness. Sunlight tried to cut through the clouds, but it was weak, pale, and thin, like even the sky was tired. Inside Marcus Brown's diner, the smell of old coffee lingered, mixed with the faint tang of grease that clung to every booth and counter. The place felt emptier than ever, as though the storm had washed away what little life it had left. 2 regulars sat near the window, their voices carrying louder than they realized, or maybe louder than they cared. They leaned close, eyes fixed on Marcus as he moved behind the counter. One stirred sugar into his coffee with slow, deliberate circles. "Poor man's too soft," he said with a smirk. "He doesn't have the stomach for business." The other chuckled, shaking his head. "Soft? That's stupidity. You don't feed strangers for free when you can't even pay your own rent. He'll lose this place, just watch." Marcus kept his face calm, but their words cut deeper than he would admit. He gripped the coffee pot tighter than he needed to as he poured a refill, his knuckles turning white. His apron hung loose around his frame, frayed strings trailing like threads unraveling. He tried to keep his focus on small things, wiping counters, adjusting salt shakers, anything to keep his hands busy. But the voices carried, crawling under his skin. He wanted to shout at them, to say they didn't understand. That kindness wasn't weakness, it was survival. For him, for the people who came through his door. But what good would it do? Words never changed the minds of people who had already decided you were a fool. So he swallowed his anger, the way he had swallowed so many things, and forced himself to breathe. By mid-afternoon, the doorbell chimed softly, and Marcus looked up. The stranger had returned. Same ragged coat, same slow steps, the same hollow exhaustion etched into his body. His beard was damp again, though the rain had stopped, as if it carried its own storm. Without hesitation, Marcus nodded toward an empty booth. "Sit down," he said, his voice low but steady. This time he didn't even wait for the man to ask. He cracked eggs onto the grill, let them sizzle until the edges crisped, then slid them onto a plate with toast. He carried it to the booth and set it down gently. "Eat, no arguments." The man's hands shook faintly as he picked up the fork. He didn't say much, hardly anything at all, but his eyes followed Marcus everywhere. As Marcus wiped down the counter as he greeted the rare customer who walked in, as he checked the cracked clock above the door, the man's gaze stayed fixed on him, silent but unyielding, and word began to spread. Neighbors noticed the ragged stranger returning, noticed Marcus serving him without question, without payment. To them, it wasn't noble, it was weakness. Some stopped coming altogether, muttering that Marcus was throwing his livelihood away on men who didn't deserve it. Others came only to watch, to whisper, to shake their heads. Suppliers started pulling back. One delivery truck didn't show. When Marcus called, desperate for an explanation, the voice on the other end was cold. Pay what you owe first, then we'll talk. That night, Marcus stepped outside to toss the trash. Two men leaned against a lamppost, their words sharp in the damp air. Man's drowning himself, one muttered. Don't feel sorry for him, he chose this life. You can't feed everyone. Marcus froze, trash bag in hand, their voices ringing in his ears. For a flicker of a moment, doubt pressed heavy on his chest. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was the fool they thought he was. He stared at the cracked sidewalk, at the trash bag sagging in his grip, and the thought cut deeper than he wanted to admit. But then his mind pulled up faces. The old woman who cried when he gave her soup on Christmas. The little boy who licked his plate clean because it was the first hot meal he'd had in days. And the silent man now sitting inside, eating like every bite was a lifeline. Those faces pushed the doubt away. He dropped the trash into the bin and turned back to his diner. Inside, the lights buzzed faintly. Marcus leaned against the counter, weariness heavy in his eyes. He didn't see the way the stranger looked at him then, didn't notice the slight change in those hollow eyes, how they softened, almost warmed, as though recognizing something rare. The whispers outside grew louder, the doubts clawed harder, but Marcus Brown kept showing up, and the silent man kept coming back, always watching, always waiting. The rope of Marcus's life was fraying fast, but the stranger in the booth seemed to know something the rest of the world did not. That this story one game is as far from over, and the man everyone mocked might be standing on the edge of a turning point no one else could see. By the time the week dragged toward its middle, the diner felt less like a business and more like a sinking ship Marcus refused to abandon. The shelves in the pantry, once stacked with flour, beans, and fresh produce, now stood nearly bare. He stretched what little he had, turning scraps into meals with the stubborn hands of a man who refused to give up. A half bag of rice, a few onions with soft spots he cut around, a crate of bruised tomatoes he'd bought cheap from a vendor who still had enough pity left to give him a discount. The grill hissed as he stirred a pot of tomato stew, the smell rich enough to trick the senses into thinking it was more than it really was. He added salt sparingly, stretched the portions with water, and served it to the two customers who sat in silence, pretending not to notice how thin the broth ran. They paid in crumpled bills, their eyes downcast, as if ashamed to be witnesses to a man pouring the last of himself into a business everyone said was already gone. Marcus moved through the motions with deliberate calm, but his chest was tight. Every scrape of his spoon against the pot felt like a clock ticking down, every ragged breath a reminder of how close he was to the edge. The bills in the office drawer had begun to feel less like paper and more like shackles. That morning when the mail came, he almost didn't open it. The envelope was thick, stamped with bold red letters that seemed to shout at him from the counter. He stared at it for a long while, thumb tracing the seal, heart heavy with a dread that had been building for weeks. Finally, with hands that wouldn't stay steady, he tore it open. The words leapt off the page like knives. Foreclosure. Unless his debt was paid in full, the diner would be seized within days. That was all the time he had left. He let the letter fall to the counter, his head sinking into his hands. The sound of the refrigerator's hum filled the silence, steady and cruel, as if mocking the way his world was collapsing around him. By evening, the diner was quieter than usual. The rain had stopped, but the street outside was dark, empty, save for the faint buzz of the failing neon sign. Inside, the booths were barren. Only one man sat near the corner, the stranger. He had returned, same ragged coat, same hollow eyes. Marcus brought him a bowl of rice and stew, the very last of what he had managed to scrape together. This time, instead of walking away, Marcus slid into the booth across from him. He sat there exhausted, shoulders heavy, eyes red-rimmed from more than just the sting of onions. For the first time, he let the weight of his own weariness show. The stranger ate slowly, his spoon clinking against the chipped bowl. His eyes stayed fixed on Marcus, unwavering, intent. For a moment, Marcus thought he might speak, say something, anything, but no words came. Just that same steady, unreadable stare. Marcus leaned back against the booth, staring at the ceiling as though the answers might be written in the cracks of the plaster. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was quiet. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, maybe not even to the man across from him, maybe just to the walls, to the ghosts of his mother's words that lived in his memory. The stranger's spoon paused midair, his eyes softening almost imperceptibly. He lowered it back into the bowl without a sound, his gaze never leaving Marcus. And though Marcus didn't know it yet, that silent exchange meant more than all the whispers outside, more than the jeers of neighbors, more than the foreclosure notice sitting like a stone in the drawer. Something was shifting in the silence. The diner's walls were cracking. The roof of Marcus's life was about to cave in. But in the corner booth, a man no one understood was watching every fracture with purpose, waiting for the moment when the whole truth would reveal itself. The night stretched long inside Marcus's diner, the kind of night where silence seemed heavier than sound. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the windows streaked with trails of water that caught faint reflections from the neon sign outside. Its letters still flickered, buzzing like an insect caught in a jar, a dying heartbeat against the empty street. Marcus sat across from the old man in the booth, a chipped mug of coffee between his hands. He hadn't planned on talking, but the exhaustion had worn away his defenses. Sometimes silence breaks a man more than words, and the stranger's steady gaze made it impossible to keep everything buried. "You know," Marcus began, his voice low, rough around the edges, "my mama used to tell me never to close the door on the hungry." He let out a short laugh, more breath than sound. "Said God gave us two hands, one to feed ourselves, the other to lift someone else. That's what she lived by. That's what I try to live by." The stranger didn't move, didn't nod, didn't speak. He just watched, spoon resting in his bowl, his eyes locked on Marcus like he was holding every word close. Marcus rubbed a hand across his tired face. She worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Still, every Sunday she'd cook enough to feed not just us, but half the block. Folks would line up outside, some she didn't even know, and she'd smile like feeding them was the only thing that mattered. And his throat tightened. "I thought I could carry that with me. Thought maybe I could build something where nobody ever had to feel that hunger again." He gestured faintly around the diner, his hand dropping back to the table like the air had pulled the strength right out of him. "But look at this place, empty booths, bills stacked higher than my head, neighbors calling me soft, suppliers shutting me out. I try to keep my doors open, but it feels like the whole world's trying to close them for me." For the first time, the stranger's expression shifted, so subtle most wouldn't notice. The lines around his eyes softened, the stillness in his gaze warmed, just barely. He lifted the spoon again, slow and deliberate, as though his silence was not a lack of words but a choice, a test. Marcus leaned back against the booth, his shoulders heavy, his chest rising and falling with a sigh that seemed to drain him completely. He pressed his palms together, elbows on the table, like a man trying to pray without knowing how. "I just wonder sometimes. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am too soft to survive." The words hung in the air, heavy as stones. The stranger ate quietly, but his eyes told a different story, one Marcus couldn't read, though he felt its weight. Minutes ticked by, the hum of the fridge filling the silence again. Marcus finally pushed back from the booth, forcing a tired smile. "Anyway, eat up, it's on the house, like always." He stood, picking up his rag as if wiping counters could hold his world together a little longer. Behind him, the stranger's gaze lingered, intense, thoughtful, as though something inside him had shifted. He didn't speak, not yet, but his silence was no longer empty. It was loaded, deliberate, a quiet vow forming in the shadows. And though Marcus didn't know it, though he still felt crushed under doubt, that silent bond, those unspoken moments over a bowl of cheap stew, were laying the foundation for something neither man could have predicted. The whispers outside grew harsher, the bills in the drawer grew heavier, but in the corner booth of a dying diner, kindness had already planted a seed. Morning broke with a gray, unforgiving sky. The streets glistened from the night. As rain, but there was no freshness in the air, only the heavy weight of damp concrete and tired souls walking to work with collars pulled up against the chill. Inside the diner, Marcus moved with a weariness that had become second nature. He brewed coffee, cracked eggs, and flipped pancakes that no one came to order. Every sound, the hiss of the grill, the scrape of spatulas, the tick of the clock, echoed in a hollow room that felt less like a restaurant and more like a waiting room for failure. By late morning, the door swung open, but it wasn't a customer who stepped in. 2 uniformed officers entered, their boots wet from the street, their presence sharp and final. Behind them trailed a man in a stiff gray suit, clipboard tucked under his arm like a weapon. He glanced around the diner with a vulture's eyes, circling for scraps. Mr. Brown? One officer asked. His tone was clipped, formal, stripped of sympathy. Marcus set the coffee pot down slowly, wiping his palms on his apron even though they weren't wet. His voice came out steady, though his throat felt dry as paper. That's me. The officer nodded toward the man with the clipboard, who stepped forward, eyes flat. We're here on behalf of the city. This property is in foreclosure. Unless payment is made in full, you're required to vacate by the end of the week. The words landed like stones on Marcus's chest. For a second, the diner seemed to tilt around him, the buzzing neon sign outside flickering against the window, like it was mocking his weakness. He gripped the counter, knuckles whitening, just to keep himself steady. From the back booth, a couple of locals watched, their voices low but cruelly audible. Told you he wouldn't last. All that free food finally caught up to him. Their chuckles slithered across the room, wrapping tight around Marcus's heart. He swallowed hard, jaw tight, but said nothing. What was there to say? The truth was written in red ink and signed with seals. His dream, his mother's legacy, was about to be ripped from him. That evening, Marcus served dinner to what few customers trickled in. His hands trembled slightly as he ladled out soup that had been stretched thinner than ever, but he forced a smile anyway. When a young mother came in with 2 children, faces pale and hungry, Marcus didn't hesitate. He set down plates in front of them without asking for a cent. The mother's eyes filled with tears, but she whispered, "Thank you." Behind him, the officer's words replayed over and over in his head. Vacate by the end of the week. The whisper of neighbors layered on top. Kindness doesn't pay rent. And yet, even with everything closing in, he couldn't bring himself to turn anyone away. In the corner, the old man sat again, silent, watchful. His ragged coat was still damp, his beard still wild, but his eyes seemed sharper now, brighter somehow. He watched Marcus hand food to the children, watched the way Marcus's shoulders slumped only when he thought no one was looking. And though he didn't speak, something about the way he leaned forward, elbows on the table, told a story Marcus couldn't yet see. Marcus wiped his brow with the back of his hand, staring at the cracked tiles beneath his feet. He was tired of the whispers, tired of the struggle, tired of being told he was too soft to survive. And yet, when he glanced back at the kids eating with desperate hunger, something inside him whispered louder than all the doubt, if I can cook, they can eat. The diner was on the edge of collapse. The officer's notice hung in the office like a death sentence. The neighbors whispered louder each night, convinced they were watching a man drown in his own foolish kindness. But the stranger in the corner booth, he watched differently. His silence was not judgment, it was intent, deliberate, almost protective. And while Marcus thought the week would end with the death of his dream, the truth was far more dangerous, far more extraordinary. His breaking point was close, but so was the revelation that would shatter every assumption in that room. The week bled into its final morning with a kind of dread that clung to Marcus's skin before he even unlocked the diner door. The sky outside was bruised with low, heavy clouds, the kind that threatened rain but held back just enough to keep the world tense. The neon sign above the entrance sputtered faintly, its buzz weaker than ever, as if it too knew its days were numbered. Marcus brewed the coffee, cracked a couple of eggs onto the grill, and listened to the silence between every sound. It wasn't just the emptiness of the diner, it was the weight of something coming. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, in the way the clock's hands seemed to scrape forward, dragging him closer to the inevitable. By mid-morning, the inevitable arrived. The diner door swung open, and the 2 uniformed officers stepped in again, their presence cold and official. Behind them walked the same man in the gray suit, clipboard in hand, his polished shoes tapping against the worn tile like a gavel striking judgment. "Mr. Brown," one officer said, voice clipped and final. "It's time." Marcus stood behind the counter, his hands gripping the edge until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to speak, wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat like sand. Around the diner, what few customers sat with their coffees turned in their seats, their whispers rising into a cruel hum. "Told you. Knew this place wouldn't last. Kindness doesn't pay the bills." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. Marcus felt it sink into his chest, heavy and suffocating. His dream, his mother's dream, was collapsing right there, in front of everyone. He closed his eyes for a second, steadying his breath, trying to hold on to a last shred of dignity. He thought about the children he'd fed, the strangers who'd left his diner with warm food in their stomachs when they'd walked in empty. He thought of his mother's voice telling him not to shut the door on the hungry. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe he had been foolish all along. The officers moved toward him, papers in hand, their steps echoing in the silence. Marcus's throat tightened, his heart pounding. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. And then, outside, the low growl of engines broke the moment. Tires screeched softly against the curb. Heads turned toward the windows as a line of black SUVs rolled up, sleek and imposing, their engines humming with authority. The gossip fell silent. Even the officers paused, their eyes narrowing as the doors to the vehicles opened in unison. From the first SUV, a figure stepped out. The sight of him made Marcus's heart stumble. It was the old man, the same ragged stranger who had sat in his booths night after night, wrapped in a coat that looked like it had soaked up every storm of the season. Only now, he wasn't ragged. The coat was gone, replaced by a tailored suit, pressed sharp and gleaming beneath the weak sunlight. His beard was neatly trimmed, his posture straight, his presence commanding. Behind him, assistants in crisp attire carried thick folders and briefcases, their movements brisk, purposeful. The diner froze. Forks stopped mid-air, coffee cups hovered in hands, and every whisper died in an instant. Even the neon sign outside seemed to quiet its sputter, as though the whole street had fallen into a stunned silence. The old man walked toward the door, each step deliberate, unhurried, but heavy with intent. The officers stiffened, unsure, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath them. The man pushed the door open and stepped inside, his shoes clicking against the diner floor, with a sound that carried like a declaration. Marcus's rags slipped from his hand, falling soundlessly to the ground. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as the truth began to take shape in his mind. The man wasn't who he had seemed. The stranger who had eaten his food in silence wasn't just another drifter, wasn't just another hungry soul wandering in from the rain. And as he stopped just a foot away, standing taller than the fear in the room, Marcus realized that whatever was about to happen next would change not only his diner, but his entire life. The room held its breath. The truth was seconds away. The diner was so still it felt as though time itself had stopped. Even the old refrigerator in the back seemed to quiet, its steady hum falling away beneath the weight of the moment. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the man in the suit, the man who only days earlier had shuffled into the diner with trembling hands and a ragged coat that looked ready to fall apart. He walked with a calm authority, each step echoing across the worn floorboards. Gone was the slump of the shoulders, the hunched shuffle of a weary body. His stride was straight, deliberate, the kind of walk that belonged to someone used to being followed. His assistants trailed behind him, their briefcases heavy with papers, their expressions sharp and unreadable. Marcus stood frozen behind the counter, breath shallow, palms pressed hard against the surface as if it were the only thing holding him upright. The rag he always carried lay forgotten at his feet. His heart hammered so loudly he swore the whole room could hear it. The man stopped a foot away from him. For a long moment he said nothing. He just looked at Marcus, really looked at him, as though he had been waiting for this very moment to weigh his soul in full daylight. Then, without a word, he set a thick leather folder on the counter. The thud echoed like a gavel striking. The whispers started again, timid, uncertain. Who is he? What's go research? Thing on? That's the homeless guy, isn't it? Marcus's throat tightened. His voice broke into the silence, hoarse and unsteady. I don't understand. Who are you? The man finally spoke. His voice was calm, deep, carrying an authority that silenced the diner in an instant. My name, he said slowly, is Ezekiel Wright. Gasps rippled across the room. Customers glanced at one another, mouths open, eyes wide. Even the officers shifted on their feet, recognition dawning in their expressions. Ezekiel Wright was no ordinary name. It carried weight in the city. A billionaire investor, a philanthropist whispered about in boardrooms and charity galas, a man with power that reached further than most could imagine. Marcus blinked, shaking his head as if refusing to believe what his ears were telling him. But you, he stammered, you came in here with nothing. Ezekiel's eyes softened, just slightly. I came here to see if kindness still lived in this world. I wanted to see if anyone would give without expecting, if anyone would open their door without judgment. I dressed as nothing so I could see everything. He paused, his gaze steady. And you, Marcus Brown, did exactly that. The diner went silent again. The locals who had whispered cruelly days before now sat frozen, shame burning hot across their faces. The man they had mocked as foolish had just been lifted into the spotlight by someone whose presence made the entire room feel smaller. Ezekiel pushed the folder closer across the counter. Inside are the deeds to this building. Your diner is now yours, free and clear. Every debt has been paid in full. The officers glanced at one another, their authority suddenly irrelevant. The man with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably, his confidence draining away as quickly as it had entered with him. Marcus stared at the folder, his hands trembling, eyes wet. I don't, Ezekiel interrupted gently, his voice ceasing, airing both strength and quiet compassion. You gave me food when I had nothing. You gave without asking, without hesitation, even when the world told you it would ruin you. You passed a test, most would have failed. The silence that followed was different now, not mocking, not cruel. It was reverent. The whispers of scorn had transformed into murmurs of awe. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight. He looked down at the folder, then back at Ezekiel. His lips trembled, but no words came. The diner that had felt like a coffin hours earlier now felt like a doorway, cracked open by something bigger than he could comprehend. And as the neon sign outside flickered once more, light spilling weakly into the diner's front window, Marcus realized it wasn't dying at all. It was trying to shine. The folder sat on the counter like a miracle Marcus was too afraid to touch. His trembling hands hovered above it, fingertips brushing the smooth leather cover before pulling back again, as though contact alone might make it vanish. The room held its breath with him. Customers who had come only for coffee now leaned forward in their booths, their eyes wide, caught in a story unfolding larger than they could have imagined. Even the officers by the door stood motionless, their eviction papers drooping in their hands, suddenly meaningless. Ezekiel Wright, once ragged, now commanding, kept his eyes fixed on Marcus. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no smugness in his voice when he spoke again. Only quiet authority, the kind that carried weight without needing to shout. This place, Ezekiel said, sweeping his eyes across the diner's worn walls, the cracked vinyl seats, the sputtering neon sign beyond the window, reminds me of where I came from. A neighborhood like this raised me. Streets like these taught me how to fight and how to survive. And men like you, Marcus, men who gave even Waha's son. And they had nothing, are the reason I'm standing here today. A murmur ran through the diner. People exchanged glances, realizing for the first time that this wasn't just a test, it was a return. Ezekiel wasn't a stranger parachuting into their lives. He was one of them, shaped by the same kind of hunger, the same kind of hardship. Marcus shook his head, still lost in disbelief. But why me? His voice cracked. There are people out there with bigger dreams, with more to offer. I'm just trying to keep my mama's place alive. Ezekiel leaned closer, his expression softening. That's exactly why you. I've been watching this neighborhood for months, watching who stepped up when the world turned cold. Do you know what I saw? He paused, letting the silence stretch until it pulled every soul in the room toward him. I saw you, a man mocked for being too soft, a man who fed children when his pantry was empty, a man who carried his mother's legacy like a torch, even while everyone around him tried to smother the flame. Tears stung Marcus's eyes. He pressed a hand to his mouth, trying to steady his breath, but the emotion poured through him anyway. He thought of the nights he had stood in this very spot, exhausted, wondering if kindness had made him a fool. Now those same choices that had nearly broken him, were the very reason he was standing in the presence of a billionaire who had come back to change his fate. Ezekiel gestured to the assistants behind him, one step forward, opening a briefcase filled with papers, contracts, blueprints. Not only is this diner yours, free and clear, Ezekiel said, his voice steady but warm, but I want to expand it, fund new locations, build something bigger than just a single corner shop. Marcus, you're not just a restaurant owner. You are the heartbeat of this community, and men like you don't deserve to sink. They deserve to rise. The room seemed to tremble under the weight of those words. The same neighbors who had whispered behind Marcus's back now looked at him with wide eyes, their faces flushed with shame. Some bowed their heads, unable to meet his gaze. Others whispered in awe, their tones changed completely. Can you believe it? Someone murmured. He was right all along. Kindness does come back. Marcus's hands finally fell onto the folder. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the deeds, the stamped seals, the signatures that confirmed it was all real. His diner was saved, his debts erased, his dream resurrected. He pressed his palm flat against the papers, grounding himself in the reality of it. Tears slipped down his cheeks, and this time he didn't try to hide them. Across from him, Ezekiel gave a small nod, as though acknowledging a truth between them that needed no words. For the first time in months, Marcus's chest felt lighter. The fear that had haunted every step, every breath, was gone, replaced by a hope so fierce it almost hurt. And outside, as if on cue, the clouds finally broke. A shaft of sunlight cut through the gray sky, streaming across the cracked neon sign and spilling into the diner's front window. The light fell on Marcus's face, warming his tears, making them shine. The man mocked as too soft to survive had just been chosen as the one to lead something greater than he'd ever dared imagine. And the story of Marcus Brown, the poor black diner owner who fed a stranger when he had nothing left, was about to echo far beyond the walls of his small, weathered shop. The sunlight streaming through the diner's foggy windows felt almost unreal. For months, Marcus had lived in shadows of debt, doubt, and whispered scorn. But now the light seemed to fall on him like an embrace. He stood behind the counter with the folder pressed to his chest, tears streaking his face, his body trembling from the weight of it all. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trembling from fear. He was trembling because hope had finally walked back into his life, dressed in a suit and speaking his name. The officers lowered their papers, their tone suddenly subdued. One cleared his throat and muttered something about no longer necessary before retreating toward the door. The man with the clipboard, once so confident, so smug, looked down at his shoes, the power gone from his posture. He followed them out silently, the echo of his steps almost ashamed. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The same neighbors who had sat in corners, mocking Marcus for giving away food, now watched him with faces heavy with regret. Their whispers, once sharp as knives, turned into hushed words of awe. A woman near the window whispered, "He never stopped. Even when he had nothing, he never stopped." Her voice cracked, and others nodded, their expressions softened by shame and admiration. Ezekiel Wright remained standing, his gaze steady on Marcus. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice carrying both promise and certainty. "You fed me when I had nothing, not once, but again and again. You showed me who you truly are, not just when it was easy, but when it cost you everything. That's why I chose you. This diner won't just survive, Marcus. It will become a light for this whole neighborhood, a reminder that kindness is never wasted." Marcus wiped at his face, his voice unsteady but firm. "I don't know what to say. I thought I was losing everything. And no." He looked down at the folder in his hands, then back at Ezekiel. "Now I realize I never lost the only thing that mattered." Ezekiel tilted his head, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "And what's that?" "My mama's words," Marcus whispered. "You don't close your door on the hungry. God gave you two hands, one to feed yourself, the other to lift someone else. I thought those words were dragging me under, but now I see. They were saving me all along." The diner filled with a silence so complete it felt holy. Even the hum of the fridge seemed to soften, as if it too were listening. Then slowly people began to clap. It started with a single pair of hands, hesitant at first, then stronger. Others joined in, the sound building until it echoed through the diner's walls, spilling out onto the street. Strangers walking by paused to peer through the window, drawn by the sound of celebration. Marcus looked around, overwhelmed. The shame on his neighbors' faces had melted into something else, respect. For the first time in years, he wasn't just the poor black restaurant owner fighting to keep a dying dream alive. He was the man who proved that kindness, even when mocked, had the power to change everything. Ezekiel placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, firm and reassuring. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start the next chapter. New staff, new supplies, new beginnings. But one thing must never change, your heart. That's what makes this place different. That's what makes you different." Marcus nodded, his throat too tight for words. He looked around his diner, at the cracked vinyl seats, the faded walls, the sputtering neon sign. For months, these had been symbols of his failure, but tonight, under the weight of applause and sunlight breaking through clouds, they felt like symbols of something else: endurance, faith, and rebirth. He lifted his chin, eyes burning with tears, and spoke so the whole room could hear. "Tomorrow morning when these doors open, anyone who's hungry will still have a place at my table. That will never change, because that's what saved me." The applause grew louder, filling every corner, rolling out into the street until it felt like the whole block was alive again. Marcus stood tall, the folder clutched against his chest, tears shining in the sunlight. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was holding his dream together with tired hands. For the first time, he felt carried. Outside, the rain-washed pavement glistened under a sudden break of blue sky. The neon sign above the diner sparked once, then glowed brighter than it had in months, buzzing strong and steady, as though it too had found its second chance. Marcus Brown, mocked for his softness, nearly crushed by his own generosity, had been proven right. His kindness had not only saved others, it had saved him. And as the diner filled with clapping, laughter, and the smell of coffee and stew, the truth stood undeniable. Kindness always finds its way back.